Good afternoon. My name is Stephanie Younger-Moet, and I'm president of the board of the Colombian American Association. These are fraught times in Colombia, and we have received enormous interest on programming. And as a result of today, begins a series of events that we hope to continue until next year's presidential elections that focuses on understanding the various dynamics in the country and providing balanced and thoughtful analysis on what has proved and what will continue to be a very fluid and volatile environment. This panel today is a terrific one, and I hope everyone finds it both a productive and insightful discussion. So let me turn this over to our moderator for today, Camila Zuluaga. Camila.
Thank you, Stephanie. Good afternoon to everyone. Thank you for the invitation to moderate this panel. We have wonderful people joining us to understand what is going on in Colombia. And a lot of us are trying to understand what is happening in our country. We're trying to find solutions and answers, and that's what we're going to do today. That's why I want to introduce our three panelists. One, I'm going to introduce first the women. That is Elizabeth Dickinson, Senior Analyst, Colombian and International Crisis Group. Elizabeth, welcome, and I'm so happy to be able to talk to you today and to discuss about what is going on in Colombia.
Thank you for the invitation.
And also it's here with us, Juan Carlos Echeverri, founding partner of eConcept, former Colombian Minister of Finance, and I will say that he is gonna run for the presidency. So Juan Carlos, welcome. Thank you for being with us today.
Hi, Camila, thank you for having me.
I don't know if you're running already and if you're announcing everyone that you're gonna be a candidate. So
is this part of the panel topics or not?
No.
Okay, good. So I don't have to answer.
And we have Paul Angelo, which is a fellow for Latin American Studies Council of Foreign Relations. Paul, thank you for being with us, and it's a pleasure to be able to talk to you as well today.
No, the pleasure is all mine. Thank you for having me.
Okay, so first of all, I would like to ask Elizabeth about the reason of the protest, and also if you think if this is a continuation of the protest that we saw in 2019, or if you see any difference between what we're seeing right now and what we saw back in 2019.
So thank you again for the opportunity to be here and also to speak with all of you today. I really appreciate it. I'm based here in Bogota, and I guess the answers that I'll give here and the discussion that I hope I can offer is based on several weeks of really running through the country, trying to speak with protesters and others and try to understand what's happening. So I've been in Cali last week. I was in Meta and Guaviare, Putumayo, Cucuta. So have been trying to get a sense of sort of where the pulse is on these protests. So I think the answer to your question is really that they are a continuation, but they're also there's also a break. There are new elements to the protest that make them more significant and in many ways more difficult to unravel. So they are a continuation, I think, in the sense that they draw on some of the primary concerns that Colombians came to the street with in 2019 as well. Largely based on social inequality, a feeling that the economic system is exclusionary and doesn't offer access, frustrations about the ability to get education, to rise through the labor market. I mean, a sort of frustration with a class system that I think has started to show really to wear on sort of particularly the working class. So that was sort of the foundation of the protest in 2019. What's happened since then, of course, is a year of pandemic that has hit, as we all know, Colombia, a very difficult year in terms of health outcomes, but also in terms of economic outcomes. With on and off quarantines for almost a year, the private sector has been devastated. Informal labor, particularly, which of course, as we know, for lower and middle class workers, is a lifeline, has really been devastated. And so we see the levels of poverty and inequality just become far more striking, but also visible. I mean, one of the things that the pandemic did was make it very clear what are the stakes of being poor in Colombia. Poor people living in the lower income stratas had much worse health outcomes, were far more likely to become infected with COVID, and far more likely to have fatal cases because of a lack of access to healthcare, but also because they simply couldn't isolate. They couldn't stay home. They had to leave their home every day to find a way to feed their houses, their children, themselves. So I think this sort of brought to the forefront, I think, a lot of these social and economic concerns. Added to that, and it's erupted several times in the interim, including during the pandemic between 2019 and today, is I think frustration with a conflictive and a frustrating relationship, let's say, between communities and the police. And this has manifested itself in several ways: accusations of brutality on some sides, accusations of vandalism on other sides. But the fundamental reality is that this relationship is broken, that there isn't trust between the two sides, and it does go both ways. That the community has a lack of trust in the policing infrastructure, and the police in turn, I think, are wary of the community because of the threats that they've also faced in that direction. So this is sort of the context where we are. But I want to note two other differences that make these protests very different from the context in 2019. The first one is that it's a far more diverse cross-section of society. In 2019, the protests were really dominated by university students, labor unions, sort of organized syndicates. So there was a sort of structure in a way to the protests. Today, we have a much more broad cross section. You have far more youth who are neither studying nor working. You have older people who have come to the streets in larger numbers, the elderly, underprivileged. I think you really have a cross section, and including you have more members of the so-called middle class, which have struggled to hold on to that position in the middle class during the pandemic. The second notable difference that I think is very important is that today the protests are not only urban. Of course, that's the most visible manifestation, but we have protests in 30 of 32 Colombia's departments. So this is also a rural phenomenon. We've had campesinos, Afro-Indigenous communities, transport companies, all mobilizing in rural areas, blocking intercity roads, but also just manifesting their frustration at a local level. This is, again, much less visible, but in many ways, it may be the harder part to unwind because these protests are very deeply entrenched and rooted in local grievances that won't be able to be addressed at a national level of negotiation. They stand to really reconfigure the construction socially of the society in the years going forward.
Okay, I want this to be a conversation. So if Juan Carlos or Paul or you, Elizabeth, have anything to say about other comments that the other panelists are saying, you're more than welcome. And also I wanted to say to the people that is watching us right now that we're gonna have Q&A. So if you have any question, you can send it through the text in the Zoom platform. But following what you said, Elizabeth, I wanted to ask Paul about Cali, because yes, we have seen protests in the whole territory, but Cali has been the epicenter of these protests in Colombia. Why Cali? What is happening in the Pacific? Why is there the most difficult situation that we're facing in our territory?
Sure, thank you, Camila. And I would defer to Elizabeth on this point because she was most recently in Cali. It's been a couple of years since I've been back to the city, but I have spent much of my career working in Colombia's Pacific. So I can speak to more structural issues at play. And you know what, I would say that, as you've mentioned, Cali is the de facto capital for the Pacific region of Colombia. And the Pacific really is a place where all of Colombia's challenges converge. You've got poverty, you've got a longstanding abandonment by the state, incredibly poor infrastructure. There are only 2 paved roads that communicate the entire Pacific coast, which is nearly 1,000 miles long, with the rest of the Colombian interior. And of course, insecurity. Cali has always been a major logistical hub for drug trafficking organizations and insurgent groups and paramilitary groups, given its geographic placement between areas of the country where coca cultivation is high, historically in the Llanos Orientales and in the Parque Nacional de las Hermosas and the southern part of the country, with the Pacific, which over the past decade and a half has become an area of the country through which much of Colombia's cocaine production exits for Central America and Mexico. And so because of the vast insecurity in the Pacific region, we've also seen waves of displacement from rural parts to Cali. And I think, and I would love to hear Elizabeth's comments on this, but I think that Cali is, as well as become an epicenter for this protest movement, given the informality in which many communities exist in a city like Cali. I would also just offer that the Colombian government has made the argument time and again that these protests are really what's at the core of these protests is meddling by Nicolas Maduro from neighboring Venezuela, Castro Chavismo, and remnants of the FARC, which have now, of course, disbanded, but there remain dissident structures, and of course the ELN that are exacerbating the challenges that are faced by the state and by security forces in Cali. And I would just offer that, yes, for a very long time, you've had the ELN trying to take advantage of protest movements, trying to infiltrate. But I would just like to note that if the ELN or the FARC dissidents were going to have a place in Colombia where this would be possible among the major cities, Cali would be it. Given the persistence of illegal armed structures in the rural parts of Cauca and Valle de Cauca. But that is not to say that I believe that these illegal armed groups or these insurgents groups represent the majority of protesters, or even I would say that they're a significant minority, and perhaps are probably behind some of the vandalism that we've seen. But really, I think to ascribe what we're seeing in Colombia today to those kinds of groups really avoids recognition of the broad sense of malestar social that Elizabeth referred to in her initial remarks.
Okay, you said something, and that's a question that I wanted to ask to all of you. So I'm going to start with Juan Carlos about what you said on Venezuela, because the government, President Duque, is trying to tell the international community that we have been pressured by Venezuela, and there's a lot of people here in our territory that are trying to impose the Castro Chavismo for the next elections. And I wanted to ask you, the three of you, if you think that's an important part of the protest that we have been seeing this year. And I will start with you, Mr. Echeverri.
Thank you, Camila. Well, first, the answer is I don't know. It's very difficult to know whether there is direct involvement of the Venezuelan government or through indirect channels. What is true probably is we can differentiate two big movements. One that is, let's say, the students and labor unions, which are massive protesters, which represent probably a wide constituency of people with grievances, with things that have been signed in previous agreements and that has not been actually fulfilled in the past by the government. And those grievances are probably justified. The government in Colombia, not this government, probably all governments in Colombia have been too fast to sign a lot of conditions in previous problems. And then you go after year, and you see that many of those agreements were not really held up. But there is another group, different from students and from labor unions, another group which is more, let's say, is an undercurrent, darker, with a stronger capabilities of creating blockades and vandalizing private property and vandalizing infrastructure, who actually mingle in the difficult situations. They are very well organized. They're probably well financed. There has been some reports in the press according to which there is a procurement for them in terms of food, in terms of help. And the question is how that is financed. I have some back of the envelope calculations, and that tell me that you have, as of now, those groups needed financing around $10 million in 1 month in order to create 300 places in different cities and in other like 40 or 50 places in roads, blockades during 3 weeks. That costs a lot of money. So question, who is financing that and for what purpose? And then I connect with the answer that Paul was giving is why in Cali. And then Cali can be considered partially the border town between Cauca, Nariño, Putumayo, Caquetá, and let's say more mainstream economic activity of Colombia, where the Pacific coast and the southern departamentos or states have a stronger presence of illegal actors financed with narco trafficking, etc. So there's this undercurrent, which is very difficult to know how much involvement is of that from the south. And your question was, well, what about Venezuela and these other sources of financing. So it's impossible to know, but there is this suspiciousness that there could be involvement, that there's money financing the infrastructure for vandalism, for blockages and curtailing the whole system of supply of Colombia, which is really destabilizing. So we have come from a social movement from students and labor unions to a deeply destabilizing force with the capability of having presence in many cities and many roads in Colombia, which has escalated this. So, question: is that related to Venezuela or not? We don't know for sure. Is there suspicion that there is some financing and some support? Yeah, there is, but not only from there, also from the cocaine cartels acting in the Pacific. The Pacific coast of Colombia and in the southern part of Colombia. So there are many different forces. Probably, I cannot say it because this is not a fact, but it's suspicious that there are many forces, many layers of this going on top of the students and the labor unions.
Let me ask this question to Elizabeth, because Elizabeth, you have been in the streets, you have been in the whole territory, and who is financing and for what purpose the protests that we have been seeing during this whole month in our country? Do you think, as the government said, that it might be like a far left force internationally that wants to destabilize Colombia as they did in Chile and end up with the reform of the constitution?
So the protests, as I've seen them throughout the country, do not really require that much or any financing. And most of the people who are involved in them, many of them are neither working nor studying, feel that they have nothing to lose. Maybe we're eating 1 or 2 meals a day. Maybe now, because of community donations, they're eating 3 meals a day at a communal soup kitchen, but they're certainly not being paid to protest. They're not being paid to stand, every night in the same place, but they also aren't working. So it's not that they're losing their income stream either. There's a level of desperation I think we really have to absorb here. These people don't need anyone to motivate them to protest. There is a broad discontent throughout the Colombian society. So I think, stepping back, I want to make a clear distinction here, which is what's motivating the protest and who's taking advantage of the protest, because it's very different. It's very different. It's very important to understand which is which, because if we confuse them, we can risk escalating the crisis. So what's motivating the protests are these social factors, this frustration with the economic situation, with a lack of social mobility, with all the things that we've already mentioned. Now, are there actors taking advantage of the situation? Absolutely. But you cannot tell me that armed groups are putting people on the street, because it's not true. Armed groups, are they taking advantage of the situation, for example, to traffic or, for example, to commit criminal acts? Absolutely, because they would be crazy not to. This is a moment of extreme uproar and social confusion. And so, of course, the actors that are going to be agile enough to take advantage of that situation are going to be in the illicit economy. I think there's a very clear way to understand this, and I hope that this is an example that I think can illustrate what we're talking about, because there are different types of vandalism. And I want to talk about this, because not to justify any of the vandalism, but to explain why it's happening. So there's vandalism that happens because of anger. So I lived in the Middle East for 10 years before I worked in Colombia. I lived through the entire Arab Spring, and I can tell you that young, angry men can destroy a lot of things without anyone paying them to do it or having any political reason behind it. So a lot of vandalism is truly anger. A second category of vandalism, and again, I say this not to justify it, but to explain it, is political vandalism. So an example, in the blockades in Cali, the larger blockades, for example, the Puerto Resistencia, which is one of the largest. If you go to that area, you'll notice something remarkable, which is that all of the local vendors, the community stores, the little tiendas on the corner, they haven't been touched. Their windows are not broken. They have no graffiti on them. They have not been vandalized. Why? Because the vandalism has been targeted towards multinationals, larger chains, that community particularly feels like are infringing on their local economic and food security. So there are rules that are actually imposed within the blockade that you can't touch the local vendors. And so, yes, has there been looting and rioting and burning in the other stores like Di Uno, Justo y Bueno, Éxito? Absolutely, they're destroyed. But you look at a local vendor and they haven't been touched. That's political vandalism. Again, it doesn't justify it, but it explains at least what's behind it. I think the third type of vandalism, and this is the type that I think has gotten the most attention, is criminal vandalism, taking advantage of the situation to commit criminal acts. And of course, there are examples of this from Cali. For example, highly sophisticated robberies of gas stations in which they extract the entire equipment from the station and take it out. That, of course, is not protesters. That is an illegal interest that's taking advantage of a chaotic situation and the inability for the security forces to be present in the area at that moment to commit a criminal act.
But Elizabeth, I heard in an interview one of the guys from the first line saying that during this month of protest, they have achieved more than the FARC achieved in 50 years. So I was wondering when I heard him saying that, if the way of changing the political structure in our country is changing. Now it's not on the countryside with armed groups. Now they're trying to change the political system, the economy system with these protests in the street. Are we facing kind of the same? It's just that we are seeing it in different scenarios?
I definitely think it's notable, for example, that we had a peace accord that really largely spoke to the rural areas. We haven't really had that similar social conversation that addresses the root frustrations of society at an urban level. And so absolutely, I think some of these frustrations are a reflection of that. I also think that something that's quite clear here on the ground is that these protests are really only possible because we're in a post-conflict scenario. For so many years, these questions were repressed by this sort of collective deference to the fact that there was an existential conflict in Colombia, the government against the FARC. That conflict now we've turned the page on that largely. And so all of these other issues that have been building for decades have actually started to come to the surface, and they're able to do so politically. So in many ways, this protest actually represents a political evolution, a positive one, that allows Colombia to have conversations that haven't been possible for many decades.
I think that's a very optimistic way of putting it. So that would be like say, I don't know, what Camila said, I think is very telling. Is there are many people, and I think that's the case actually, that say that this month has been more impactful on Colombian economy and Colombian institutions than 50 years in the jungle. Why? Because after this month, basically the whole supply chain of the country, the way people get to work, I mean, normal, ordinary workers get to their firms to work, just a second, is curtailed. People are not able to go to work, especially in Cali, but in many other cities during. Second, so firms are not able to produce. They have their debts piling up. They cannot pay their debts, right? Because they are not selling. They cannot take the products to their clients, to their buyers. The seaport of Buenaventura is closed, which is the main supplier of foreign imports to Colombia. And then you put the state in the economy as a whole, and the Colombian institutions and the government on its knees. And that's something that the FARC wasn't able to do in 50 years. Now, saying that this is a good, just a continuation, a nice continuation of a good movement, I think is really optimistic. I don't think that 50 million people now have to get out of work. Hundreds of thousands of firms, especially small firms of 2 or 3 people, being broke. Tens of thousands of medium-sized firms broke, right? Many people been hungry, right, because of this. So is this a nice continuation of the FARC grievances against the government? Is this what we need for the Colombian government to go to its knees and negotiate? This is basically a cruel way of dealing with long-standing problems that will last forever, or will last for a long time and need 5 years, 10 years to solve. I think that we come from a very harmful period since 2015, where we had the oil crisis. So the economy suffered a big, a substantial economic crisis. And then we came to the pandemic, 1.5 years of crisis and suffering, social suffering, biological sufferings, people dying, people being sick. And now, of course, if you add these two crises between 2015 and today, that, of course, creates a lot of suffering, a very justifiable grievances of many people against the economic situation. But that doesn't mean that the way of dealing with this is crippling the whole economic system, causing even more suffering in order to prove that this is a nice continuation of the FARC fighting now in the city, and in our roads. I think that there is a fracture, an analytical fracture between what the country is suffering, which is terrible, the consequences of this that will be terrible, and if this is the best way to handle social economic problems in Colombia. So I kind of disagree with this rosy picture of this is nice, that this is happening. It's kind of nice because it forces people to suffer, and then all the polity of Colombia to collapse, and the economy as well, bringing it to a brink of collapse. I have to disagree with that.
But the international community is seeing it that way, the way Elizabeth put it on the table. And the international community put their eyes on Colombia because of the riots, but also because of the excess of the force used by the police. And one of the things that the people is asking in the streets is to reform the police. If they didn't act in such a repressive way, probably the international community wouldn't be saying what we heard about Elizabeth, that they truly believe. I understand that you don't agree with what she said, but the international community in many places are thinking and are seeing things that way. That's why I wanted to ask you, Paul, talking about the police, talking about the repression, talking about the images that the whole world saw of how they treated the people and the students in the streets, do you think it is mandatory and the government should tram it like a police reform? Should we get into it to try to solve what we're seeing right now or not?
Sure, and I think you're absolutely right that the protests in Colombia have legs internationally speaking, because the conversation that's being had in Colombia is the same conversation we had last year in the United States about police brutality in the wake of George Floyd's killing, and the rise of the protest movement and the organization of protests led by Black Lives Matter here. Likewise, what we're seeing, particularly on social media, are linkages being made between activist groups in Colombia and activist groups elsewhere. I've seen graffiti coming out of Cali in support of Palestinians, graffiti in support of Chileans, graffiti in support of Black Lives Matter here in the United States. And so I think that this is having an effect of pushing the conversation, or putting the conversation front and center in places like the United States and even in Europe, because of the international solidarity. And so, I think to that point, what distinguishes the United States and Colombia from other countries in the world is the fact that we are democracies and we strive to enforce police accountability. And I think that that's something that has been completely lacking in the case of Colombia, at least in terms of the rhetoric coming out of the government. It took the Duque administration about 2 weeks into the protests to at least signal with its rhetoric in the direction of denouncing excessive use of force by police officers and signaling in the direction of accountability. But to your broader question about the reform of the police, I think it's absolutely necessary. It's something that I expressed in a recent op-ed for the Washington Post. I don't think that any presidential candidate going into 2022 in Colombia can have a serious conversation about the political situation in the country without advocating for some kind of reform of the police. And it's something that the Centro Democrático has already tried to do, has presented a number of some legislation in Congress focused on reforming the police, but those reforms would merely tweak the way that the police is currently structured. And what we're really talking about is a sort of an institutional shift. The Colombian National Police is an organization that since the 1950s has been a part of the Ministry of Defense. There was an instinct in the early 2010s as the country was negotiating peace with the FARC that the police would become something else in a post-conflict period. And that really never came to fruition for a lot of reasons, most significant of which is that I think really President Santos, who had expressed an interest in creating a Ministry of Citizen Security or relocating the National Police under the Ministry of the Interior, just simply ran out of time. But it's a project that hasn't been taken seriously by the current administration. And I do think that if we are talking about delivering accountability for crimes, we can no longer treat instances of police brutality in a military justice system, for one. But secondarily, the Colombian National Police have a formation and have an indoctrination that was very much focused on an internal armed conflict and on internal enemies. And so to Elizabeth's points about the stigmatization of protesters, I think in many ways it's very difficult for the average beat cop out in the streets trying to deal with protest to differentiate between a protester, a vandal, and an insurgent. And in order to usher in a process that trains police to make those kinds of necessary distinctions, I don't think that the Colombian government can in good faith retain the National Police as an entity or a sub-entity of the Ministry of Defense.
This extremely use of force that we have seen in some cases from the police to protesters, do you think this might affect the international relations of Colombia, maybe with the US? Do you think that would have an effect on the international and the foreign relations?
Well, I think what's having an effect is not necessarily the fact that police abuses exist, because they exist in every democratic system. They exist here in the United States, and we're not demanding purity. But what we are demanding is that civilian government in Colombia take very seriously the accusations of excessive use of force, and that the civilian government actually delivers justice for them. And I think something that has become a rallying cry in Colombia, particularly in this issue of police brutality, is the case of Cruz, who was killed by a beanbag bullet that was shot by the ESMAD in 2019 protests. That is a case that was, after much deliberation, was referred to the military justice system because it was seen to have taken place, the act of excessive force was seen to have taken place within the context of the police's performance of his duties. And unfortunately, as that case 2 years later still sits in the military justice system. And so for the 28 or so officer involved incidents or abuses that have been documented by Human Rights Watch in this latest wave of protests, the Colombian government must absolutely exact accountability for them. And I think that more than anything will ensure that the Colombian government remains in good standing with the United States and other leading democracies in the world.
We are already receiving a lot of questions from the audience, but I want you to remind that, so if you want to make more questions, we are receiving it here from the Q&A. But Paul, you said something about the 2022 election and that no candidate can go to the 22 election without talking about the political reform. So then, Elizabeth, I wanted to ask you about that. What is the role the political election, the presidential election that we are going to face next year is affecting the protests that we have seen on this year, on 2021?
Yeah, so I think one of the major impacts actually right now is that it's making it harder to look for a negotiated exit to the situation, because all sides politically are thinking about how their behavior will reflect on their election results, rather than necessarily thinking about what is an exit or what concessions might I or others need to make in order to make this happen. So I think that's sort of the number one sort of impact that it's having right now. And when you go and sort of talk to protesters on the street, I think they're quite adamant that they're not there for any political candidate. And in fact, you hear a diversity of opinions. It's certainly not pro-Petro rallies. They're certainly not pro-Fajardo rallies, pro-Coalición de la Esperanza rallies. I mean, it's a mix. And similarly, I think, you don't see a uniform condemnation of sort of one political party or another, in reverse of that. So I think that in many ways, the protest will be the context for the 2022 elections, but I'm not sure that the elections themselves are driving that dynamic. Having said that, I really fear that it will be difficult to get out of the current situation before the elections because of the politically weak situation in which we find ourselves for this government, but also because of the politically weak situation for the National Strike Committee. So we have a negotiation right now in which both sides are in a very difficult position politically to compromise. The government, very low popularity levels, just based on the opinion polls, but also struggling with support within his own political base. So President Duque, I think, has really struggled to maintain that core of support. And then, of course, at an electoral level, even less so. He lacks a coalition in Congress. So that means he comes to the negotiating table in a position that makes him less likely to offer significant concessions. From a similar standpoint, I think the National Strike Committee is also weak in their negotiating position. They're weak, first of all, because their demands are so diverse and they can't speak with a unified voice. But second of all, because there are many protesters who say they don't feel represented by the strike committee. And therefore it's difficult to know if the strike committee can really deliver the protesters. So for example, if they promise to do X, Y, Z, if there's an agreement tomorrow, it's not clear to me that the strike committee has the ability to change the dynamic on the ground. In some places they will, but not in all places. Now, I think we do have a sliver of hope actually in the last 24 hours, because there has been a softening in some of the regional roadblocks. And this is a result of discussions that happened, interestingly, not at a national level, but at a departmental level. In the strike at the moment, there's the National Strike Committee, but then every one of Colombia's departments has a strike committee. And it's been in those spaces where we've had actually more space for negotiations with governors, with alcaldes, with delegations from the national government, but not necessarily the national government itself. And in those spaces, I think where you've had a little bit of more flexibility to make, concessions, and really because people are living the situation directly, there's also a will to be a bit more pragmatic. That's a space where we've seen progress. And again, in the last 24 hours, we've seen blockades soften or lift in Catatumbo, in Cauca, in Huila, in Putumayo, Caquetá, Meta. So this is a situation that hopefully can gain momentum. I think that's happened first because the protesters have realized that blockades are really weighing on people, that they're becoming increasingly unpopular. But second, because there have been these local level negotiations that have more political flexibility than the national level dialogue, which really is tied in this electoral dynamic.
Okay, and in the meantime, the economy is suffering a lot. And a lot of people is asking, so how can we get out of this crisis? And I wanted to ask you, Mr. Echeverry, how can the Colombian economy move forward to get out of this crisis with all this political thing going on in the territory and in the streets, and with a government so weak, as Elizabeth said?
Camila, I think these things are linked together very strongly, because economic decisions they don't exist in a vacuum from politics and from security, especially in Colombia. In Colombia, you have had a very robust economy, which has been able to work in spite of Pablo Escobar and bombings 30 years ago, FARC terrorism and ELN terrorism 10 years, 12 years, 20 years ago. And nowadays, I think we have, I was watching now, looking at the poll by Centro Nacional de Consultoría that asks the following: do you consider that in this moment Colombian democracy is in danger? And 68% of people, so more than 2 out of 3 people, think yes. So 2 out of 3 Colombians, according to this poll, says the Colombian democracy is in danger. And there's another question, which is there a crisis of representation? So 71% of Colombians are not affiliated or don't feel represented by any political party. So the problem here, Camila, is that we have a problem of governability. Moises Naim wrote a book some 10 years ago, something like that, the Venezuelan thinker, called The End of Power. And what we're seeing now is kind of that, not only in Colombia, in the US, in France, in Spain, in Italy, in Chile, in Ecuador, is power is not what it used to be. So the economy will now be acting in this vacuum of power. And we're seeing an epochal shift in which power now with cellular phones, you are able to convoke very easily a demonstration and strike in 10,000 people, 20,000 people show up in the street. 10 years ago, 20 years ago, you needed political movement, you needed organization. Nowadays, is this is spontaneity, and that can bring any government to its knees, and they can feed this governability crisis for weeks, for months. We saw it in Hong Kong for more than a year. We saw it in Paris for almost a year. We saw it continuously in Chile. And then how will the economy will learn to work in this situation? In Colombia, what we see, and I think Elizabeth was very vocal and very eloquent in saying, look, there's spontaneous vandalism, there's political vandalism, and there's criminal vandalism. And the economic actors, first workers and employees, on the one hand, they cannot go to work, as I said. Inputs they cannot get to the firms and to the factories, and the final products cannot get to the consumers. So you impose a huge suffering on a country, and politically that becomes unsufferable. And then economically, you start seeing this crippling of the economy, bringing it down. So I think it is a very insecure, very uncertain situation in which the capability of the actors that go against the order, and the capability of the government trying to impose the government in the middle, the police situation that you mentioned here. Of course, the police, all the attacks to civilians are unacceptable, and all the violations on human rights are unacceptable. But you have also to think of policemen in the street in a coordinated situation when there is this mixture of criminal, political, and spontaneous vandalism, and there's this policeman there. They have to act, of course, following the strictest standards of human rights respect, but very complicated situation. So in this situation, what I see is first the government and the state losing most of or strong parts of its capabilities, and the economy system, so the firms and workers and capital and financing and debts, etc., starting working in a very uncertain situation that basically creates a downward spiral for the country. So it's a very, very, very complicated situation that will end up, and I will finish with this, and that very ironic. For instance, young people are demonstrating because they need more jobs. We will end up in this crisis with even fewer jobs, thousands or probably millions of fewer jobs. Second, they strike because the tax reform probably was going to increase the prices of food 20%, 19% because of the VAT, right? Now the price of food went up 50%, 100%, 200%, the price of potatoes, the price of eggs, the price of milk, right? They increase. So it's very ironic. The demonstrations ended up having the impact of less jobs, higher prices to middle class and poor class people. So we ended up in a worse situation than we started in.
There's people asking a question that I think a lot of Colombians have, and also a lot of people outside the country. And it's if this situation, Mr. Echeverry, will lead to a Petro presidency. People is asking and wondering if what we're living right now will lead to Petro win the election next year.
I think it's very uncertain. I don't think, as Elizabeth said, and Paul as well, people are not really politically affiliated in these protests. People are in this. I was in Cali and I was in Medellin, and young people are in this belief of everybody. Nobody can say, I am now receiving, no, I am now the beneficiary of this. Politically, people are kind of fed up of everybody. People are suffering. People have been suffering for 2, 3, 4, 5 years when the country economy started like flattening after a period of of 10, 15 years of growth was exactly the same in Chile. You see in Chile, the economy was growing. In 2015, 16, the economic growth flattened, and then people felt the situation. That can even be the case in any country. China needs to grow in order to keep its people quiet. So politically, I think the government is suffering politically horribly. The let's say center right or right wing parties are suffering, and the center left and left wing parties are suffering as well. People, the whole political system is not is being part of the culprit first, and part and holding the blame for many of the things that are happening. So professional politicians are not and I don't think Petro, which is actually the question, I don't think that Petro can necessarily benefit the middle class, probably, who's people who are still holding a job, which is not right. People who cannot get to work. I was talking to a taxi driver in Colombia, in Bogota last week, and she was angry at everything. She wasn't pro anything. She was really angry, even angry at the protesters, right? She was driving the taxi driver. So nowadays, I don't think nobody can claim that this is politically good for him or for her.
Elizabeth, what do you think about that question that everyone is wondering? Is this gonna lead to a presidency of Gustavo Petro or not?
No, I completely agree with what Juan Carlos just said. I mean, I think there's advantages and risks from both sides. I think Petro kept a distance from the protest specifically because he was very concerned about the risk that he would be associated with chaos that has emerged from the protests, which could hurt him. And so if the image sticks that what a Petro presidency would lead to is a situation of blocked roads and protests and burning tires, of course, that's not going to help him electorally, because he has to win more than just his base in order to move forward. That goes the other way as well. I think, that this has brought forward so many of the sort of, I guess, traditionally left-wing political demands, such as redistribution, basic rent, broader government support for higher education, things like that. You could argue that it might support those candidates, but I think the jury really is still out. And again, this is a judgment of the entire political class. I think, something that was said to me on the streets in Cali the other day, I think maybe brings it home, which is that a young man said to me, it says something, it's a reflection of Colombian democracy that being here on the street is the only way we feel like we can be heard and participate in the system. It's also telling of the situation that, for example, the strike committee at a national level does not include anyone from the street. There is no voice that has risen organically from these protests to represent them in the higher leadership. And this is reflective of sort of this elite dynamic that we all just talk to our friends and familiar faces, and we can't actually open up participation. I think that's really at the core of what we're seeing here. And none of the establishment political figures have been able to speak to that in a way that's convincing.
We're holding this conversation in the Colombian American Association, and that's why I think this question that I'm receiving right now, it's important, and I wanted to ask this question to Paul. Paul, I have a person sending me this question, and it's, what is the role of the United States in this whole context? What is the role the US should play in the situation we're living right now in Colombia?
Yeah, I mean, I think the United States is the sort of Colombia's longstanding democratic partner in the hemisphere. President Joe Biden has described Colombia as the most important strategic partner or foothold of the United States in Latin America. And so I think that, looking beyond the Paro, I mean, I don't think that the United States has a specific role necessarily to play in the Paro, but I think that just in terms of solidarity with the Colombian people is sort of the stated or inherited policy for the US government across administrations, regardless of whether or not there's a Democrat or Republican in power here in Washington, DC. There's broad bipartisan support for Colombia as a democratic partner and especially as a security partner. I would say that, more broadly speaking, when we think about what, given the importance of the security sector and the Colombian military and police to the US government as partners. In just a couple of years ago, the Colombian military was invited to be the only Latin American partner nation that invited to be a partner to NATO. it's preserving and building on that relationship. And I think given firstly, the Biden administration's legacy, having many members of the Biden administration help oversee or usher in a period immediately following the FARC peace accords with the implementation of Peace Colombia, which is a major bilateral initiative to help finance the implementation of the FARC peace accords. I think that is going to be a big part of the Biden administration's policies towards Colombia going forward, and really reinvigorating the support for the implementation of the peace accords and the revitalization of rural economies. Likewise, I would say that the U.S. can play a helpful role in helping the military and police engage in agenda setting, in preparing for the really difficult kinds of roles that the security forces have been asked to play or perform against the backdrop of a post-conflict period, while you also have illegal armed actors still inhabiting parts of the countryside and engaging in illegal activities, while also contending with social protest. So I think that the United States will remain an important security partner in that regard.
In the past, the US got involved with Latin America trying to keep a certain political and economic model. I'm not saying that's how it should be, but that's what happened in the past. They were involved in Chile, in Central America, and so on. And now that we're seeing people trying to change the economic model in the continent, I wanted to ask you, Mr. Echeverry, do you think that here the National Strike Committee have that goal at the end, that they want to change the economic system that we have?
I want to answer, but first to give a follow-up to Paul's, to your question.
Of course.
As I see it, we have Colombia in the middle of two pressures, right? Mm-hmm. One from the east, from Venezuela, with the Cuban, probably Russian and Iranian support. Probably, I'm saying, I don't know, I'm not an expert in that, but probably. And from the west, you get the Mexican cartels, narco-trafficking cartels from the west. And then Colombia is like in the middle of a very complicated international situation. Colombia is with Mexico probably the best partner of the U.S. And in the Caribbean, if you see the Caribbean, you see Cuba, you see Nicaragua, you see Venezuela. Colombia is in the Southern Caribbean, is the most important partner of the U.S. So it is critical. The U.S. international policy is now looks not north-south. They don't look at Latin America, right? The only thing that is really important for the U.S. in Latin America is Honduras, Nicaragua, and El Salvador because of the southern border situation. But Colombia is at a crossroads moment because it's in the middle of this illegal pressure from the west, from the Pacific, and the narco-trafficking cartels, and then these strong geopolitical forces that materialize in Venezuela via Cuba and these other. So Colombia is critical, and the situation for Colombia in the next 10, 20 years is critical, I think, for the US, and would probably justify a more serious involvement of the Biden administration. Having said that, now I come to your question.
But it's related, because if we are between two forces and we're also one of the forces is coming from the east, that means like a change in the political and the economic model, not only in the economic but in the politically. So do you think we have a pressure right now going through that path? Because that's what we are seeing in Chile. Chile is going to change their economic model. No doubt that's what's going to happen there.
Yeah. But look, let me give you just a purely economist's response to this place.
Okay.
Yeah, which is, let's say you have the state in the middle, right? You have social demands rising, right? And the economy capacity going down. So in the middle is the state. The only solution is populism, right? So because it's people want more, but you have less. So you print money and you do all the. So I think that we're seeing the Argentinization, not only of Colombia, and the whole Latin America. Even the IMF is supporting that. Is go get a lot of debt, say yes to everything. No, it doesn't matter that your economy is collapsing. It's okay. You got no. print money, go to debt, go to New York, go to Washington, we will give you money. You will pay at some point. At some point you will default. That's what will happen. At some point you will default. So the IMF and the World Bank and the institutions that I know very well, and they used to be very credible, are now in a crossroads. Yeah, because these guys are promoting basically the very complicated populistic solution, which is, yeah, your economy is collapsing, but spend more. I don't say that is an easy way out of this situation, right? Because yeah, people are in hunger and the economy is not producing more. So in the middle of that, what you say, Camila, is this going to lead to a new, different economic model? Definitely. Especially for countries like the Pacific countries, Chile, Peru, and Colombia, and even Mexico, which have been so far the so-called Pacific Alliance. We have been trying to produce a more like a stable economies with good macroeconomic management, et cetera, et cetera. This probably lasted until now. Let's say the Washington consensus, which was an stability consensus, now it doesn't hold anymore. Probably is sad. It's sad. People like me, we have been trying to during 30 years, 40 years, to generate the most stable economies possible in Latin America. I think Chile was very stable. Peru was kind of stable. Colombia was kind of stable. Mexico as well. But probably we will be more similar to the Atlantic countries, in which you issue more debt, enter into financial problems every 10 years, and then there's a downward spiral. I do fear that from a very purely economic point of view, we are sliding towards a more uncertain and less serious economic management. Absolutely.
We don't have that much time left. I think we have like 3 or 4 minutes. So I wanted to ask to all of you, like a last question. So how we get out of this? Elizabeth, I'll start with you. You have been in the streets. You already said what you have seen. What should be done? We have elections next year. And you said that you thought that these might continue until we have the presidential election in May 29th. So what should be done to get out of the crisis? What do you think?
Well, I'm very glad to go first in this impossible question. No,
I know.
Look, I mean, I think the exit isn't clear yet. However, I think there are some elements maybe that we can say will have to be part of it. So I think one of the things that's very clear is that this is going to have to be a negotiation that's layered. This cannot just be a central government talking to labor unions discussion, because neither of those parties can deliver an agreement at a national level that's going to stop this crisis. It just can't have a centralized solution. So I think you need to have sort of an articulation down to department level negotiations, municipal level negotiations. It could even be neighborhood level negotiations. You know, it's truly amazing. You visit some of these protests in Cali, in Bogota, and they have their own ecosystem, really. That's going to require sort of local government having, you know, discussions, getting to know them. What do they need? What do they want? And sort of slowly unraveling the process. I think what's missing from that, because many of the elements are actually in place, which is, I guess, good news. You have department level strike committees. You have local pliegos, which are basically sets of petitions from different departments, from different municipalities, where people are on the streets. Much of it is actually on paper, so you at least know sort of where your targets are. But what's missing right now is, let's say, political will from the central government to give an impulse, let's say, to that broader dialogue. So right now, local mandatory holders, for example, will tell us, you know, alcaldes say, we don't feel empowered to have these negotiations because we don't know that the government won't come after we've agreed to everything and blow it up, in the sense that they say, no, you can't do that, you can't do that. They're not involved in this local level, which means that there's no coordination. So I think you really have to, you know, make this vertical. from all the way to the bottom, all the way up to the top. And you need to make sure that they're all talking to each other. I do think that a second piece of this is exactly what Paul spoke to so well, which is that there has to be at least an acknowledgement that this relationship between the community and the police is broken and it needs to be fixed, that people demand more accountability, a policing system that's really built around community security. Look, the police is an institution that's extremely functional at exactly what it was built to do, which is counter narcotics, anti-criminal activity, looking for insurgents. I mean, these things is a very strong institution if you judge it by those indicators, but that's not the function that it has today on the streets. And so there needs to be this sort of shift of mentality, and it's not just retraining, it's really an institutional shift that at least needs to be on the table to be discussed, I think, for this to have a credible exit strategy. Those to us, I think, as crisis group would be sort of the main components going forward. But a final thing maybe to say is that, you know, we've really been missing political courage in this crisis. No one has been willing to take hard decisions, no one, and I say that categorically across the board. There's a lack of political courage to get out of this crisis. And without that, I do think that you could have a sort of churning situation that fails to really move forward in any one direction or another.
Elizabeth, but you said that there's a lack of political courage, and I have a question from the audience, and I wanted to ask you then that question. This lack of political courage that we have seen during this past month, do you think it's due to Duque's lack of experience, or maybe his lack of leadership?
Look, part of it is the electoral situation. Part of it is that no one really has any good ideas. Part of it is just a question of characters and people and broad sets of interests that no one really feels like they represent. But we really are missing this sense of leadership. First from the government, truly. But second, also, I think from the street, that there isn't a strong voice who can really call together this movement. And that puts us in a very hard situation, because there isn't a unifying voice that can speak to what one side or the other is able to deliver, let alone what they want to deliver.
Paul, I know, as Elizabeth said, nobody has the answer. We are like discussing right now what is going on in Colombia and what should be done. And nobody has a unique answer, but I want your point of view in this brainstorming. How can we get out of this crisis?
I would agree with everything that Elizabeth said, and I think that the most important thing is actually ensuring that the spaces for dialogue are happening at various levels of government. I mean, Colombia evolved and formalized a decentralized unitary system, starting dating as far back as the 1980s. But I think what we're really seeing is a failure of that system to breed the kind of representation that makes people feel like they're a part of democratic processes. So I think that inevitably has to be a part of this. And my only other hope in this regard for Colombia is that that both the government and its opposition, both political opposition and the opposition that it faces in the streets, find ways to depoliticize the tenor of the conversations and the dialogue. Because I just fear that the extreme polarization of Colombian society is going to leave Colombia without very many good options, looking firstly into 2022, but then long into the future. And so to the extent that we can have conversations about very pragmatic solutions for the demands that are being made of the government, I think that not only serves Colombia and the Colombian people in the long run, but I think it represents the best opportunity for Colombia's longstanding democratic institutions.
Thank you. And Mr. Echeverry, you go last in that question. That is going to be our last thing we said today.
Thank you, Camila. I think that all crises are crises of leadership. I have been working in crisis for the last 20 years, and basically we definitely need a strong leadership and use the crisis to get out of the crisis. What you see now, for example, you have to involve anyone. The economy, the basic entrepreneurship of Medellin, of Bogota, of Cali, they feel like solve the problem for me. That's not the way it works. Colombian economy nowadays is not big enough to solve Colombia's problems. For me, that's the main issue. You have to create a new economy if you're going to solve these problems. The economy now, it doesn't have enough money to pay for all the demands that are in the streets. Is that unsolvable? No, that can be solved, but you have to create a new economy. You have to ask the people to invest in, for example, I have been saying that in many places, ask people to invest in Cauca, in Nariño. There are so many business possibilities in poor Colombia, in the whole region of the Caribbean coast, the Pacific coast, the southern part. Involve everyone, show that there are lose-lose situations. And the second element, not only change your fundamental understanding of how the economy have to solve this problem, but change state efficacy. The state efficacy of Colombia is very bad. This is a dysfunctional state. Elizabeth was describing it as verticality, right? Colombia's state is like a nervous system where you have something in your finger and you feel it in your brain, right? You don't have the nervous system doesn't connect. So the brain doesn't solve this problem. So they sign something. Okay, we signed something in Cauca, but nothing happens in in Bogota to solve the problem. 10 years after, Bogota is, oh, really? Have you been signing this? You still have that problem? What, schools, roads, credit? You don't have a healthcare unit in Cauca, in Macizo Colombiano, is full of coca, etc. And then the state capacity has to be changed. So what I would say is there are ways to get out of this, but we have to change fundamentally the way we do things right now in Colombia. And that involves not only, of course, the poor people, the students and the peasants and the labor unions. That involves the bankers and the entrepreneurs and substantially leadership, political leadership in our dysfunctional state. So I think this is really an opportunity, but we have to really rethink, go back to pen and paper and rethink the way we're doing things. So it doesn't work anymore the way we have been working so far in Colombia.
Thank you, Juan Carlos. Thank you, Paul. And thank you, Elizabeth, and to all of you that were connected to this panel of the Colombian American Association. We hope that these answers and this discussion made you understand a little bit more what is going on in Colombia and what can be the solutions to the crisis we are seeing right now. So thank you all. It was a great pleasure having this discussion, and bye-bye.
Thank you, Elizabeth, Paul, and
Thank
everyone.
you. Pleasure.
The Colombian American Association.
Bye.
Ciao, hasta luego.